that food was central to health. He also began to realize that despite his best efforts to sell milk, it was culture that dictated what people ate. It started a corollary idea brewing in Carl's head about how much variance there was in diet from place to place, and consequently, how much nutrition must suffer.
His idea for supplement, didn't come about in just one day. It was based upon, probably a decade of observations. He saw all these things as part of a puzzle.
Another piece came when Carl visited an archaeological dig. There were indications that the Chinese from 2,000 years ago were large and very healthy. Their diet had been filled with whole grains and likely calcium. As he looked at the nearby residents, presumably the descendants, he saw that they were in rather poor health. He suspected that somehow their diet had changed over the years. Chinese medicine counted on the local herbalist to put the body back into balance, yin and yang. Modern Chinese do the same thing. Carl took notice of herbalist practices, in part because it was so counter to Western medical thinking, where all diseases were thought to come from germs or poisons. The Chinese ideas, by contrast, had to do with putting something back into the body that was missing from the diet.
My father suddenly had an idea, and he said, aha, the Chinese kind of approach this with this herbal approach. He said, maybe there's really something to this.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
How many?
10.
10 herbs.
Yeah.
Can she tell us what those 10 are?
Yeah. 然後解釋下，呢應該嘢係呢種啦。
菌藻類有
Some kind of
a mushroom.
some kind of dry mushroom.
Mushroom looks like. When we went through the herbal shop this morning, it was very clear to me. You could see where he was beginning to get some of his ideas. And again, looking at it from a scientific basis, having blends of plant concentrates and blends of other materials that you could add to the diet made a lot of sense to him.
It dovetailed perfectly with observations he had made that the Chinese in rural areas were vigorous and strong, but in urban areas seemed much more prone to illness. Rural Chinese had been mainly plant-based in diet. Now they had moved to the cities, ate more meat, processed foods, and salt. Carl had observed health problems not only in China, but also back in the United States. There in 1924, his father had both legs amputated as a result of arterial sclerosis. It was also in the States that Carnation had done studies indicating that cows produce the most milk when fed only alfalfa and water. Carl theorized that perhaps that plant was a pure form of health food, containing balanced nutrition. He also began to consider how to process it for human consumption.
His whole concept was that maybe he could develop a supplement made from plant materials to help bring the diet back into balance. Not only the plant materials, but it was the minerals that were in things like milk and oils that you'd find in fish and other types of oil products.
This was in the early 1920s, and Renborg was dipping into fairly uncharted waters. Even the word vitamin was new. The first vitamins had been isolated just a few years earlier in 1913. Vitamin C would not be extracted from natural sources until 1930. The first synthetic vitamin would come 7 years later. So the idea that dietary deficiencies might spur disease was still revolutionary. To go a step further and say that perhaps disease could be prevented with a pill that contained those missing dietary elements met with healthy skepticism from traditional science. Certainly, Carl hadn't quite figured it all out yet. He was still trying to sell milk to the Chinese, but he wanted to make more money at it. Always entrepreneurial, he wanted to take control of his own life. He wanted to run Carnation's China operations as an independent agent. As a separate business entity, Carl envisioned being the exclusive distributor of Carnation milk products. But Carnation wasn't interested. On furlough back in America, he visited New York and went to see a man named Harry Colgate, head of an innovative company that had introduced the first toothpaste in a tube. He showed up with no appointment and asked Colgate's secretary to let him in to see the boss.
And the secretary said, "What about?" He said, "China." And it so flustered the secretary that she went in and apparently told Mr. Colgate that there was a young man in the outer office who wanted to see him about China. And Mr. Colgate said, "Send him in."
Karl Renborg got the job. He was now Colgate's sales rep for China. He was living well, but Shanghai was in turmoil. There was both criminal and political tension. The city was teeming with opium dens and prostitution centers. Local warlords battled to grab the huge profits from the illicit businesses. Politically, nationalist leaders were fighting the emerging Chinese Communist Party. In 1927, the nationalist general Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the dominant leader of Shanghai and fortified the city with barbed wire to keep out invading warlords and communists. A general strike ensued. Karl sent his wife and children back to America while he remained in Shanghai. Like other foreign businessmen, he joined the volunteer corps to protect the city from the warlords. But those who stayed were virtual prisoners in Shanghai, barbed wire restricting them to their little enclaves. Their regional offices were looted. Many lost everything. Karl was one of them. But of more immediate importance was survival. Food was tremendously difficult to come by. He and his colleagues were becoming malnourished. Karl saw it as a perfect opportunity to test his idea of a food supplement.
He began to come down in the area here and just whatever green leafy stuff he could find, and apparently others Chinese were doing this too. And then he made his little soups and gruels. And now somewhere near here they did have some animals, and he would get some ground up animal bones and he'd grind those up and put them into his soup. He used to tell people that a lot of them didn't like it. It was kind of gritty because he couldn't grind the powder very fine.
Karl's soup was a nasty concoction. He even boiled rusty nails in it for iron. But Karl saw that his friends who could stomach it fared considerably better than those who couldn't. He ate it himself. He would also feed whoever would listen to him and try it.
The Chinese thought he was pretty interesting. They kind of liked his thought process. The expatriates, the foreigners, thought my father was a screwball.
The soup experiment was fresh on Karl's mind when he was finally able to board a freighter out of China. The voyage gave him time to reflect on his Asian experience, the Chinese philosophy of diet, and its direct effect on health. He realized that while he had lost everything in Shanghai, he had been given the idea of a lifetime. Karl became more convinced than ever that he could create a food supplement that could make people feel better and live a healthier, balanced lifestyle. In turn, that would leave them better able to fend off disease and illness. He was determined to create it.
He didn't know how long it would take him. He didn't know what it would be. He didn't know if it would be a tablet, a wafer, a powder, or what have you, but it would prevent much of the nutritional problems that he saw in the world.
Those were lofty plans for Karl when he landed in California in 1927. He was 40 years old, and yet his life was just getting focused. And as Karl would love to recount years later, he had only $24 in his pocket. He had opportunities for steady work, but turned them down in favor of odd jobs, bus driver, statistician, even babysitter, that would allow him the time to pursue his dream of the food supplement. It made things hard on his marriage. Living with Karl was living on the edge, and his wife wasn't cut out for it.
She basically left him, because she didn't think he was going to ever make anything of himself pursuing this crazy idea. So I think they parted on very, acrimonious terms, and there was never any discussion of his first wife in my house, in our household.
He threw himself into his work, tinkering with alfalfa, watercress, and even parsley extracts. Karl thought beyond just the ingredients to the process of collecting them. He invented a scythe which would cut alfalfa plants so that they dropped into a specially designed basket. With this device, the plants never hit the ground and didn't have to be rinsed off. Karl was one of the first scientists to consider that washing plants might rob them of nutrients.